Ginger Alden was a wide-eyed young girl from a small town in Tennessee who was both frightened and flattered to be introduced to her lifelong idol, Elvis Presley. And it turned into a fairy tale romance.
The world of Elvis was one of exotic cars and unscheduled jet trips to Hawaii, beautiful clothes and beautiful people, and endless excitement. At 4 a.m. on August 16th, they finalized their wedding plans. 10 hours later, Ginger found Elvis dead.
Tell me about the last time that you saw Elvis, the last day that you were with him.
The last day.
He was getting ready to go on a concert, right?
Yes, and he was in a good mood and nervous because of a tour. And he mentioned something to me about playing racquetball, and I said, yes, I wanted to. So he called his cousin, Billy Smith, and Joe, and we went out back to where he has a racquetball court. And I didn't play racquetball. I sat, there's a glass partition where you can watch whoever is playing racquetball, and I watched him, and he would do funny things and try and see if we were laughing. And then he seemed to be getting a little tired then, so he came out and he sat down by me, and he didn't go back out and play then, but he got up and got on a bicycle exerciser, and he was on that for about 3 minutes. And then it was early morning, and we were going to go back upstairs, and he was going to go to sleep so he could get ready for his tour.
This was up in his bedroom?
Yes.
And that was the last time that you saw him?
Yes.
What'd you say?
The last time I saw him.
Any conversation? Yeah, any conversation?
Well, he had tried to go to sleep, and he stood up one time, and he had a book in his hand. I don't know the name of it, but it was a religious book. And he turned around and looked at me, and he said he was going to go in the bathroom and read. And I said, okay. And then that was when he walked into the bathroom.
And then you left, went downstairs? Or
no,
what?
I stayed there. I had fallen asleep there, and I stayed there. And I was going to get ready and come home later that day and pack to go on the tour.
And then when did you see him next?
That was when I walked in. I noticed, of course, he had been in there for some time. And I called
what time is this now?
This was 2:20, about 2:30.
Okay, so about, what, 6 hours had passed?
It must have been about 6 hours.
And then you went back into the room, and do you remember what you saw?
That was when I went to the bathroom, and that was when I found him.
I imagine that must have been a shocking experience for you, obviously.
Yes, and it was, of course, much worse because he had just been discussing the wedding plans that same morning.
What went on in the house afterwards?
Well,
a lot of confusion?
Oh, yes. It was something so unbelievable. People were all in different rooms praying, and it was just like something that couldn't be happening.
How has that affected your life?
It's just so difficult to come from that level. I feel like what Martin Luther King said, I've been to the top of the mountain, and I'm just trying to adjust now, but it's very difficult for me.
Tomorrow night, some happier memories. Ginger recalls her first date with Elvis and some of the things they did together in a romance that, well, was fated to end all too soon. Ginger Alden, the girl Elvis planned to marry, showed me a photograph of her with Elvis Presley, which she said had not been seen publicly before.
It was taken in Hawaii, his favorite place to work or play. She had another unusual photo. The recruiting officer at the time of Elvis's induction into the Army was her father. I asked Ginger a question on behalf of millions of American women.
What is a date with Elvis Presley like? What do you do?
Well, it's very different. I went up to see him, and he'd been telling me about his Ferrari, this car that he had. And then he asked me if I would like to go for a ride in his Stutz Blackhawk. And I said yes. And then after a while, he said to go on a ride in his small plane, the Lockheed Jetstar, around the city. So the plane was just beautiful when I first saw it because I had never seen anything like that. And the pilot, Milo High, was very, very nice. And I sat down, and after a few moments, Elvis said, "Everybody hold it." And he had this kind of smile on his face, and he said, "I'll be back in a minute." And he got off the plane and jumped back in his Stutz. And he must have gone to Graceland because he returned. And he said, we're going to Las Vegas. And he'd gotten pajamas for everyone. And he asked me if it would be all right, and I was in such shock. I said, yes, I'll call my mother when I get back. So
your first official date, instead of a spin around Memphis, you went to Vegas.
Right.
What'd you do in Vegas?
This was really fun. Everybody slept when we got there. We just stayed there a half of a day and returned the next day. Everybody was so tired from the trip.
When did Elvis propose, and how did he propose?
It was on January the 26th, one afternoon, and I had been up at Graceland, and he had been in the other room. He always had things going on around me that I never knew about, and he took my hand and took me into the lounge area of his bathroom, and I sat down in a black chair, and he got down on his knees, and then he asked me, he just said, I'm asking you, will you marry me? And of course I said yes. It was just, it was also beautiful.
And then what were your plans? When were you going to be married? When was the announcement going to be made?
He was going to make the announcement when he played here the Saturday night. He was going to have his concert here in Memphis from the stage. And he had been discussing the type of dress. He said that he had had some people working on one in Los Angeles, and that it would have small rosebuds with little gold threads through it, and he wanted me to wear glass slippers and a little tiara on my head. And he said, it's got to be the wedding of the century.
By the way, Chuck, last week's Ginger mother filed a suit against the Presley estate, trying to get it to pay her $40,000 in mortgage money, because she said Elvis had promised to do that before he died.
And he furnished the family with a home and a swimming pool, and now the mother wants it all paid for. Elvis Presley's generosity was well known. He didn't advertise it, but the people who benefited from it did.
Ginger Alden, the girl he planned to marry, was one of those. The 12-carat ring on her finger was a gift from Elvis. So were the expensive cars parked around her home in Memphis. Elvis was very good to a lot of people, and Ginger now feels that some of them were less than good to him.
There's been a lot of things said about him. Former bodyguards that were close to him said he was on drugs, lived the life of a hermit, very emotional person. What can you tell us about these things? Is there any truth to any of this?
No, I never met the three bodyguards, so I of course don't know them, but I can only go by what Elvis told me. And the book did upset him, but before it came out, he told me the only reason that the book was upsetting him was because it wasn't the content, it was the principle, because he had done so much for the bodyguards' families and things of that nature, and for them to turn and do something like that, that was what I think really got to him and hurt him.
How about the accusations that were in the book? They were all untrue? They'd just taken small incidents and blown them up out of proportion? Or...
Well, I haven't read the book, so I don't know. I've heard bits and pieces of it. But I'm sure the majority of it has been blown out of proportion, way out of proportion.
Did he use drugs?
No, he did not. He had certain prescribed medications that he had to have, and he took a lot of vitamins. A lot of vitamin pills were laying around in bottles, and I think a lot of people, if they ever happened to see that, mistook them for drug bottles, and I'm sure that's how those got started.
Was he concerned about his weight?
He mentioned to me one time that he knew he was getting overweight, and like that bothered him. And I would talk with him many times and try, for some reason, he wouldn't go out and do certain things when I tried to get him to go out. So we had our differences there, and I would try to get him to eat better foods, and I did get him on some health foods. But he would go, I don't know, it might have been his nerves or what, but he would go on binges. He would eat certain types of food for a long time that really weren't that healthy for him.
The Russian commentator said the Presley legend has been buried in the aftermath of the singer's death in a flood of souvenirs that have, and we'll quote, lowered the name of the idol to the level of a trinket. They, of course, didn't know the Elvis Presley we did. To put him in proper perspective, tonight the conclusion of Chuck Henry's series on Elvis Presley and the impact he had on the people around him.
Jerry, you know, if Elvis Presley had lived just 4.5 months longer, Ginger Alden would have been Mrs. Elvis Presley, but that storybook romance was not fated to end that way.
These days, Ginger tries to forget the tragedy of Elvis's death and remember the good things in their relationship. And about such things, she is more than willing to talk.
At what point did you fall in love with Elvis? And did Elvis fall in love with you?
Well, when I was in Las Vegas with him, this was in December, and this was the first time I had been in Las Vegas while he was performing there. And he was there for 14 days, it was like. And when he mentioned it, I just kind of smiled and laughed, and I really didn't say anything. But later on, after a few months, he started telling me how much he needed me. And then I really saw that, and I realized I needed him. I needed maturity, and that was when I really realized that I was in love with him.
You know, there are millions of women who would love to have traded places with you and have the kind of relationship that you had with Elvis. Was he a romantic individual?
Yes, he knew what to say. He could take anything ugly and make it sound beautiful. And he was very, very religious. And we would talk many hours each night on different philosophies. He had certain philosophies and different books. And he had a beautiful way of speaking, really.
A tender individual, a loving individual?
Yes, very. He was very, I've never noticed it on anybody on earth, the certain kind of love that he had. And it was true.
There's a lot of talk about what's going to become of the legend now. What would you like to see happen? You go down to Elvis Presley Boulevard and the hucksters are down there selling plastic, I don't know, buttons of Elvis, you name it, his picture's on it. What would you like to see happen? Some way to preserve the memory? What?
I would like to see a very nice building erected in his memory and with his trophies on display. And I think Elvis would like that too. And I know he'll never be forgotten by millions of fans. His name will be kept on going in one way or the other.
What one thing is going to stand out in your mind years from now, 10, 15, 20 years? What is it you're going to tell your children and tell your grandchildren about Elvis Presley?
That I shared a love with one of the greatest men on earth.
Obviously, Ginger Alden is a beautiful young woman. Millions of women probably envied her, but I wonder if they envy her now. It will be interesting, I think, to see what paths she takes in the future. Jerry?
Sure. Interesting. Very touching.